Hello, Sara.
Hello, Sofka. I'm so delighted to be here to speak with you because, as you know, I'm a huge fan of you and your marvelous novel, Putney. So thank you for agreeing to host.
Oh, thank you. Well, how are you? How have you been during these strange times?
Um, it has been absolutely incredible. I don't know about you, but I felt, it was a kind of emotional and intellectual and artistic lockdown for me, as well as a physical one. For the first few months, I found it very difficult to read, let alone write. I wasn't producing anything. The problem is that I had deadlines, and so I had to, eventually just figure out a way through it. I'm not a believer in writer's block, but I really did feel as if we were all in a period of stasis, and therefore so was my work and so were my characters. But then something really wonderful and, almost miraculous happened, which is that it kind of drove me to the work. Ultimately, the only escape and the only relief I could find from what was happening around us was to go back to the work. And so for the last few weeks, I've just been working like a nutter, really, and meeting all of those deadlines.
And where are you now? This looks wonderful.
Yeah, shall I show you my view? So
Yeah.
so I'm no longer suffering, it has to be said. We've emerged from lockdown. I'm in Grand Cayman, which is where my family is, and I'm here for family reasons. But because we have now emerged from lockdown here, my family and I have kind of taken advantage of the fact that all of the vacation properties are empty. So we're having a little bit of a staycation by the beach for a few weeks before I come back to London.
That looks really wonderful. And one of the things I was thinking about before we spoke is how it must be nearly 2 years since we first met. And soon after that, I was given a proof of Frannie Langton. And we were introduced by our mutual friend, the great book whisperer, as she's known, Gillian Stern. And I remember her saying, and Gillian is always right, she said to me about your book, this is going to be big. And how right she was. I mean, it's been such a pleasure for me just following through, seeing what's happened with the Confessions of Frannie Langton, winning the Costa Award for debut novel. You were shortlisted in the British Book Awards. So many things. What are you, long-listed on the Polari Prize? I remember last year, every time I went into a Waterstones, it was Waterstones Book of the Month, wasn't it? And people working there, they'd come up and be pressing your book into my hands. It's so good, you must read it. And I'd say, yeah, I know. And now I see it's taking America by storm. It's Book of the Month in Barnes and Noble.
That's right.
I mean, you must be feeling pretty good.
I hear you say all of those things, and it still, even now, feels as if all of those things have happened to someone else. It's the most remarkable feeling of having a dream come true, because I have always wanted to write a book. I joke that I feel like I was born wanting to be a writer. I have known nothing else, and I'm a huge bookworm. I fell in love with books resolutely and very early on, and it's been, my longest and deepest love. And so to join the ranks of published writers, people who were the superheroes of my childhood and, who I admired above everyone else, it still feels incredibly surreal. And that feeling as well of, it's a feeling of really close identification with your work, but also feeling quite distant from it, because it becomes something else, something apart from you, that almost belongs to the readers and the booksellers and not quite to you anymore. And it's the first time I've been through it. So I've tried to soak up all of the joy and the crazy adventure of the whole process of having a debut novel published, but also to remember to kind of keep grounded, to try to get back into writing the second one, to remember that it's work, You know, it's not just about dreaming it and having it happen, that you've got to put the work into it. And that's where I am. I'm kind of juggling this feeling of incredible luck and happiness with the pressure to go right back into the cave and write the second one and hopefully have it do half as well as this one did.
Yes, it's such a different process, isn't it? The process of writing, and then when you send this book out into the world. In Greece they say kalotaxido, like bon voyage, as if it's a little boat making its way out into the world. I think that's quite appropriate, really.
Yes, it's a message in a bottle, and
yeah.
you know, we send it out.
Yeah.
And then it has a life of its own, which we cannot control.
Yes, exactly. So we should say something about the amazing book, The Confessions of Frannie Langton. So what I think is so amazing, well, there are lots of amazing things we should get onto, but you managed to combine so many different things at once. So we open with a murder mystery. It's a love story between two women. It's an exploration of slavery, and of course the voice is this very unusual voice of a young female former slave, so it could hardly be a more timely book. But it's also a page turner. I mean, you just can't stop keeping going with it. So I think that you've put together this kind of extraordinary thing which is remarkable. And I wonder if we could start right at the beginning of the book, if you could give us a kind of introduction. It's 1826, and Franny herself is in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, I love hearing you describe the book that way, because, you know, it is a creature stitched together of the parts of books and material that I have loved and been influenced by. And so all of that is really deliberate. But also the fact that it's a page turner, because I think there's a kind of contract between writer and reader. And it's not just about delivering an edifying experience. It's not just about delivering a beautifully written novel. I think you really have to give readers a story. I love the feeling of not being able to sleep until you know what's happened in a book. And by the way, I got that feeling from your novel as well. A book that can transport you into a world that it has made and that you don't want to leave until it's achieved some kind of resolution, I think is truly a magical thing.
Do show us the cover, turn it around.
So there we are, that's Franny. Franny by the sea.
And can you give us a few clues about what we see there on the cover, or will that come?
So this is a marvelous cover, which is based on an original piece of embroidery that was designed for Penguin, who published the novel, by Scott Heron. And it's got all kinds of clues about the resolution of the very Gothic mystery at the heart of the novel. So there is a really intimidating looking pair of scissors. There's a skull, because of course it's really Gothic. And there are roses, which if you read the book, you'll see how they're threaded into the plot. And I should probably summarize the plot. So it is the story of Franny, who is a young Jamaican woman who is brought to London in the early 19th century from Jamaica and given as a gift to a natural philosopher, George Benham, to work as a maid in his Mayfair mansion. And while there, she develops this instant and passionate and obsessive attraction to his wife, Madame Marguerite Benham, who is perpetually dissatisfied, very enigmatic, very beautiful French woman. And Franny and Madame have a love affair. They fall passionately in love with each other, but as with all Gothic romances, it's a very twisted love affair. And it ultimately ends in tragedy when Benham and Marguerite are found murdered and Franny is accused of the crimes. And so the novel is her account at her barrister's urging that she is writing not only about what happened at this mysterious Mayfair mansion, but her life story. And you come to realize, I hope, as the reader, that it's an attempt to convince herself as much as us that she didn't do this terrible thing. as she says, I never would have killed Madame because I loved her. Because she has no recollection of the night in question, she says, other than that she was asleep. And it's my kind of homage to the Gothic romances that I grew up on. My sort of early reading nourishment was Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and Rebecca, books that I returned to year after year during my teens. And so I've described it on the road. I've developed a little tagline for it, which is Jane Eyre if Jane had shagged the madwoman in the attic and then been accused of murdering Mr. Rochester. And that's Franny.
One of the things also that I love about it is that she has this very powerful voice, and so she's not the person that you might expect. She keeps turning you in different directions. So there's a quote at the beginning that I just love, which I want to say, which is her writing. She says, "But this is a story of love, not just murder, though I know that's not the kind of story you're expecting. No doubt you think this will be one of those slave histories, all sugared over with mystery and despair."
Yes.
It's slightly cut, sugared. Yeah. I mean, it's just, that's so good, because she keeps surprising us. She's not going to just be a kind of victim in any way. So I absolutely get the kind of Jane Eyre, and she's always turning around and refusing to just take all the terrible things that are thrown at her.
It's this wonderful idea that you get from Jane, and that I got as a young woman reading Jane from the first time, that no matter how the world conspires to keep you in your place, you can be the narrator of your own story, even if it's only in your own head. And that's one of the ideas that powers Franny, that you know, she even reproduces that Milton quote at places throughout the novel, you know, about the mind being such a powerful place, because the only place where she can resist during her very difficult life is often just in her own thoughts, and she's empowered by doing so in a way that I think Jane is as well. Jane Eyre is a novel of really marvelous interiority, and I worked really hard to try to replicate that feeling with Franny's narration.
Yes, and also I wonder if we could go back to her early life. So although the present tense in the book is in London, obviously she's had this kind of extraordinary childhood and early youth in Jamaica. I mean, would you like to say a bit about that?
Yeah, she and again, much like Jane, it's modeled on the classic autobiographical novels. It's a Bildungsroman, and so her early life is spent on the rather ironically named Paradise Plantation in Montego Bay, where which is owned by John Langton, who is a particularly nasty man who, when Franny is very young, for reasons that are not clear to her at the time, decides that she's going to come and live in his house and be a house servant, which would have been a privileged position. You know, she wouldn't have to work outside, it'd be much easier work, and she'd gain access to a better quality of life. But then as time goes on, she is brought into some very sinister experiments that Langton is carrying out. And we come to learn that he's involved with a group of men of the Enlightenment, who are hell-bent on proving that Black people are not human, as one of the ways in which they could justify prolonging the institution of slavery. And he very, very twistedly brings Franny in as his young apprentice. And one of the questions that she has to answer for herself, not only then, but throughout the book, and the reason why this sort of this experience travels with her to England, is what price would she pay for preserving this kind of life for herself, access to learning and education, and living in the great house surrounded by books with which she has fallen in love. It's not just the price of survival I was interested in, but the price for her of gaining some advantage and of gaining an intellectual outlet. And you know, the cost of doing that for her and becoming complicit in what Langton is doing is huge. And it induces this feeling of guilt, which she carries and has to resolve during the course of the novel.
It's a really horrifying section, the part with scientific experimentation. I mean, it still makes me feel kind of really quite upset thinking back to it. And I mean, you open many cans of worms in this novel, Sara. You know, you're very brave. I mean, that's really, it's as if it's not bad enough looking at slavery, but then you look at this kind of horrendous process of what was going on, and this poor young teenage girl being thrown into the middle of it, measuring skulls and their dissections and all sorts of terrible things, and the implication of whether she is a whole worthy human being as well, which is a sort of devastating question. One of the things I was wondering about is, I mean, you manage the balance so well, as I said earlier on, but these subjects are really difficult subjects. They're not easy for us to think about. And I wondered how fearful you were about that. There's a sort of a danger, I suppose, with like writing about the Holocaust or other things which are desperately upsetting and difficult and resonate through people in all sorts of ways. I wondered what you thought about that subject.
That is such a good question. I think one of the things that was a real revelation to me while I was writing the novel is that it is easier to grapple with these things in fiction than it is in any other way. I interposed a great deal of distance between me and the things I was writing about, I think, simply by fictionalizing them. It really did help. I also had in mind a quote which I kept very close to me in my notebook by the great Toni Morrison, who wrote better than anyone ever will about slavery in her novel Beloved. And what she said really stuck with me, because she was asked a similar question, and she said, she reminded herself that if people could have lived through it, and they did, as we know, then she could write about it. It's not only a reminder, I felt it was also a charge. It's not just that if people could have lived about it, we can write about it. It's the fact that if people lived through it, we're duty bound to write about it. It's one of the things, one of the powers that a novelist has is to bring people's attention to things that they would rather ignore, but which it's essential that we grapple with. For example, even the race science, you know, the very particularly difficult aspects of this novel, you find a thread running all the way through that from you know, my fictional Langton to Dominic Cummings and some of his notions about you know, the ability of poor people to improve their lot in life, and whether any resources should be directed towards helping them doing that. It's all of those notions which we have inherited can be traced right back to these supposedly great men of the Enlightenment, men like Voltaire and Thomas Jefferson, and their notions about the inheritability of intelligence and the links between race and intelligence, or poverty and intelligence, and their study of skulls. And that was one of the things that I felt that kept me going, even when the material was difficult. I felt there was a compulsion to be able to come to terms with it, because it is so hugely significant for some of the political challenges that we still face today.
I really wanted to come on to politics, but I wonder if we could have that as a tempting return. If you could just do a little reading for us, and then we'll return, because I think that that's also a huge underlying foundation stone that we must press.
I'd be happy to do a little reading for you. I'm thinking about reading from the very opening of the novel, and then you can let me know if you want reading from anywhere else. But starting with the beginning, I think, is always a good idea, because it should, if the beginning does its work properly, then it should give you a flavor for the whole thing. And so this novel opens with Franny being brought into the Old Bailey for the start of her trial. It's 1826, London, and her trial is just about to begin. My trial starts the way my life did, a squall of elbows and shoving and spit. From the prisoner's hold, they take me through the gallery, down the stairs, and past the table, crawling with barristers and clerks. Around me, a river of faces in flood, their mutters rising, blending with the lawyer's whispers. A noise that hums with all the spite of bees in a bush. Heads turn as I enter, every eye a skewer. I duck my head, peer at my boots, grip my hands to stop their awful trembling. It seems all of London is here, but then murder is the story this city likes best. All of them swollen into the same mood, all of them in a stir about the sensation excited by these most ferocious murders. Those were the words of the Morning Chronicle, itself in the business of harvesting that very sensation like an ink-black crop. I don't make a habit of reading what the broadsheets say about me, for newspapers are like a mirror I saw once in a fair near the Strand that stretched my reflection like a rack, gave me two heads, so I almost didn't know myself. If you've ever had the misfortune to be written about, you know what I mean. But there are turnkeys at Newgate who read them at you for sport, precious little you can do to get away. When they see I'm not moving, they shove me forward with the flats of their hands, and I shiver despite the heat, fumble my way down the steps. Murderer, the word follows me. Murderer, the mulatta murderess. And then I'm just going to skip over to conclude the extract. A few minutes ahead, Franny has heard the indictment read. She's watching the barristers at their table getting ready to start their submissions, and she's swept away on a wave of memory back to a happier time when she's lying in bed with her mistress, and her mistress is reading her poems. A wave of memory breaks. She's lying in bed, up on her elbows with her toes pointing into the air. In her hand, an apple I'm trying in vain to coax her to eat. Listen, are you listening? She kicks one of her heels. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. I'm only half listening, because it is impossible, this thing that is happening, my mistress lying with me in her bed and reading me a poem. But also because it was one of those times when it fell to me to watch what they called the balance of her mind, like a pot I had on the stove. Is she well? I'm asking myself. Is she well? She turns to me. Do you like it? Who is it? I ask, stirring her hair with my breath. Shelley, though I like Byron better, don't you? The prince of melodrama. She turns over suddenly onto her back and closes her eyes. Byron is proof, if ever it were needed, that a man is merely spoiled by his vices, while a woman is soiled by hers. Oh, Francis, don't you think everyone should be prescribed a poem a day? Woman cannot live on novels alone. She was right about that. A novel is like a long, warm drink, but a poem is a spike through the head. That's Franny.
That's wonderful, Sara. Thank you so much. You read it really beautifully, and also it gives such a feeling of, on the one hand, the horrors of her being locked up and the threat of what's going to happen in the trial, and then on the other hand, you know, this amazing love story that she's been living. Also, I wanted to ask you, you were a lawyer for many years, and gave that up to write this book. I mean, that must have fed into at least the trial, if nothing else.
I was a lawyer for far too many years, Sofka. 17 years, 17 of which were miserable. Essentially because I knew it was a very poor substitute for what I really wanted to do, which was write. And it is, I think, true that I then deliberately constructed my first novel around a central courtroom drama so that I could incorporate some of my previous life. But I hasten to add that I was never a criminal barrister. So all of that, including any mistakes I've made, are pure imagination and research on my part. But I think the link for me between what drove my legal career and I hope what has found its way into the novel is this sense that lawyers are really empowered to achieve justice, in particular historically for people who have been unable to speak for themselves. And I was thinking of, you know, great fictional lawyers, including Atticus Finch, who was one of my kind of childhood legal heroes, and who inspired the character of Franny's lawyer, who's a young, quite nervous Englishman on his first murder trial, determined to do his best for his client, but working against the odds, you know, during a period of time where there was even debate about whether Black people were sufficiently human to be able to take the oath at the Old Bailey. So he's really up against it. And I love the idea, courtrooms are crucibles for human drama. And, you know, they sort of put people at the extremes of life. And, you know, in this case, literally a life or death scenario. And I love the idea of seeing what comes out. And as the point that Pettigrew himself makes in the trial is that, you know, in courtrooms, you get the best of life and the worst of life, and the best of people and the worst of people. And it was really interesting for me to play around with that from a non-lawyer's perspective.
And also what you're saying about which voices are heard. I mean, that takes us right round to the political side of this book. And I mean, if it was timely when it came out last year, you know, now it just seems like the perfect novel for anybody who is thinking about the Black Lives Matter and other protest movements that are happening around the world, and this greater awareness of looking not only at colonialism and our racist history, but also, most importantly, whose voices have been heard. And so this is why Franny's voice, coming across clear as a trumpet and so powerful, is an amazing thing. So I'd really love to hear your opinion. I mean, we've spoken already about the importance of fiction in looking at difficult and important historical subjects, but particularly in relation to recent events and what people have been saying. I'd love to hear your opinion.
Yeah, there's a line in the novel, it's Franny's line, but it might as well be mine, when she is asked by an abolitionist who visits her in prison about why she wants to write her own story as opposed to having one of them edit it for her and publish it and package it. And she insists on doing it herself and says to this chap, you know, men write to separate themselves from the common history, women write to try to join it. It's a line that summarizes for me the whole project of writing and applies equally to Black lives as to female lives, the lives or working class lives, or the lives of anyone who has been perceived as being at the margins, as not belonging at the center, writing is one way of moving yourself from the margins into the center. You know, that sort of Copperfield line of, you know, whether I'm the heroine or hero of my own life remains to be determined. It's one way of doing that. And the very clear link I see between what is happening now, between the fact that we still have to protest racist murders, that we still have to grapple with systemic racism, is that we haven't properly come to terms with the past. And there is a massive disconnect, I think, between the fact that we still want to airbrush the past, and by we I mean generally speaking about British history, because, you know, we're in this context, we're British and I live in the UK. We want to airbrush the past in order to be able to tolerate ourselves in the present. But the problem is that we have never then begun a process of honest atonement for what happened in the past, because you cannot atone for something that you do not acknowledge or accept. And so one of the reasons why I think I was drawn to writing historical fiction is because it seems to me still like an unresolved, unaddressed problem. This notion of what happened to us in the past, the idea of the lesser or inferior humanity or questioned humanity of Black people, that we can't simply dismiss as some sort of fanciful idea for a Gothic novel, because it underpins a lot of the science and the approaches that we carry into our policies today. It underpins a lot of the reasons why instinctively a Black man will be seen as a threat and will be much more likely to be responded to as a threat and therefore die at the hands of the police. And it underpins the reason why the election of the first Black president was met with such hostility and vitriol that we now have the backlash to that. It underpins the reason why systemic racism is still a problem, because it's not just about how people feel. It's about the fact that for centuries, legislative policy, social policy, educational policy, and medical policy were all informed by this truly barking mad idea that we somehow have to start with the question whether or not Black people are human. And that's why it's so important to me. You know, historical fiction has been kind of left out of the equation. People focus a lot on contemporary fiction in trying to understand why we are where we are. But that is missing a huge chunk of all of the relevant information, I think. We have to look to the past and understand it and be honest about it before we can have a meaningful dialogue in the present.
Do you feel any optimism? I mean, I feel that in recent times it seems as if there's been something of an awakening, at least in certain sectors of the population, and there is more of an acknowledgement of structural racism, which people were not talking about so much until recently, or certainly maybe white people or people in power were not acknowledging that. And I mean, that is encouraging, as is the pulling down of statues of slave traders and owners. It seems to me that these symbols and the acknowledgement of things is important. But do you think we can be hopeful?
I think we've reached a moment that is going to be impossible to just wallpaper over and continue as we were. And I think you're absolutely right to identify that part of that is because this is not just a one-sided conversation anymore. I think, you know, there are very few things about this pandemic that have been useful, but perhaps one thing it has done is forced us all to these moments of introspection, and also forced us to absorb the information. So what happened to George Floyd couldn't just be momentary news or a momentary experience of grief and anger. It really resonated, I think, because we were all forced to pay attention to it over and over and over again. And that meant that people joined the discussion who had never joined it before. People from all walks of life started paying attention. I actually had a moment where I felt tearful which is when I saw a video on social media of a Black Lives Matter protest in South Korea. It felt really significant to me that these ideas that had before seemed exclusive to the Black community, the grief felt purely our grief, the anger felt only our anger, and like no one else understood, that it was resonating so widely felt really significant. I don't think we will move back, but where I am cynical is, does it change anything, or does it simply mean that we now all get it? We get it, we understand, we empathize, but we cannot translate that into any meaningful action. I think what we need to do is, not to get too political, but what we need to do is to wait to see if this results in any meaningful change in who is elected and what, you know, what kind of behavior we accept from them.
There's a long way to go, isn't there?
Exactly.
I know we're going to have to finish soon, so I wanted to also mention how exciting it is that Frannie Langton is to become a film. And that
yes.
I think you've been writing the screenplay, no?
In fact, not only that, but just before I spoke to you, 15 minutes before I dialed in, I was on a call to the producers, going through their notes for episode 2, because that's my big file of notes for the scripts. So we've finished episode 2 of 4 episodes in terms of screenwriting. So I like to say we're halfway there.
Fantastic. That must be quite a different process, turning a book into. And
actually, I've got my own confession now as well, which is that I like it a lot better. It is, Sofka, I've got to tell you, I'm going to try and tempt you over to the other side. Writing screenplays, especially adapting your own material, for me, it's taken all of the pressure of plotting off of it, because I have the material. I'm not thinking about what should happen or whether it works or is well balanced or structured as a plot. I'm just thinking about how to take the core of what I produced for the novel and translate it into something different, but that retains the kind of heartbeat of that material for the screen. So, it's a wonderful, refreshing, new way of working that I absolutely adore.
Yeah, well, the Confessions of Sara Collins, we've been the best time. It's been really lovely speaking with you, Sara. I mean, it's thrilling what has happened with this book. It's a fantastic novel. Everybody should read it. Many congratulations. We're waiting now for the series. That's very, very tempting. Many thanks to you.
Thank you so much, Sofka. That means so much to me coming from you, because as you know, I admire you hugely. And thank you so much for hosting our conversation as well. I really appreciate it.